Well, most human beings spend at least some time looking in the mirror. And when we do this, when we look at ourselves in the mirror, I'd say there are two main reactions that we have. One is kind of like, a good hair day. We feel good about ourselves and how we look. The other is when you wake up and you think, I don't remember that wrinkle before, or I had a little more hair there, or whatever, bad hair day. And, so we can do this. We do this often. We look at our physical selves in the mirror and we make a judgment. But, we also do this in our spiritual life. Sometimes we look at ourselves, but we're not looking at the physical self. We're thinking about who we are as people. We're thinking about the spiritual state of our lives. And sometimes when we look in the mirror spiritually, figuratively speaking, there are two things, again, that we often say in response. The first is that kind of, uh-oh reaction, which is the realization that all of us, I think, have, that sometimes we're not the person we should be, right? Sometimes we're not the people God calls us to be. And then another reaction. Other times we're feeling good about ourselves and we've had a wonderful experience or whatever, and we look in the mirror spiritually and we see a beloved child of God, right? A wonderful gift of God. And here's the really weird thing about looking at the mirror spiritually. Both of those responses are accurate. They're both true, right? Even though they sound like opposites, it is 100% true that we sometimes let God down. But it is also 100% true that we're beloved children of God. It's 100% true that we can be selfish and sinful and self-centered and all this kind of stuff. And it's also 100% true that we have the potential to be wonderful people in this world and to serve God and to share our gifts with others. And this is kind of one of the basic paradoxes of faith. It's one of the ones that Lutheranism has really held on to. The founder of our particular tradition, Martin Luther, liked to call this simultaneously saint and sinner. That as Christians, we're not one or the other. Each of us are simultaneously saint and sinners. And that is the basic claim I want to make with you today and think with you about today. How a healthy Christian life, and really a healthy human life, involves kind of coming to terms and embracing both of these identities, realizing that both of these are accurate self-definitions of ourselves, and rather than picking one or the other, kind of figuring out what it means in the world to be both a saint and sinner at the same time. So let's first talk about the first response of looking in the mirror of spirituality, the self-critical response, right? The uh-oh response. I remember having an experience of knowing my sin when I was in high school. So when I was in high school, I had my problems like everyone else and whatever, rebelled like everyone else. But I had a really good youth group at church and I liked going. And one day it was getting close to my birthday and it was going to be youth group and I heard they were going to play a game I really like. And I used to go there with my friend. And I was hanging out with my friend before a youth group. We were driving around, and it was time to go. And I was like, all right, let's go. And he's like, yeah, okay. And then he said, actually, I want to go and get an ice cream at McDonald's first. And so he goes through the drive-thru, it takes like 5-8 minutes, and gets an ice cream. And I'm like, okay, fine. All right, let's go now. We're just a little bit late. And he's like, okay, but actually I need to get more gas in my car. And he goes to the gas station and starts adding gas to his car. And I'm just getting so frustrated, but finally the gas gets in there. And I'm like, all right, let's go. And he's like, okay, but actually I left my hat at your house. Let me go pick it up. And I was like, what do you mean you left your hat? Can't we get it later? And he's like, no, we need to get it now. And he drove me to my house, and we both got out. I opened the door, and there standing in the living room is my dad. And he says, oh, son, I'm so happy you're here. I have some heavy boxes in the garage. Can you pick them up for me? And I was like, no, I can't pick them up. I'm late for youth group. There's this fun game. I want to get there. And he's like, no, son, just go and move these boxes. It'll be real quick. And I said, why is everyone bothering? And I kind of exploded at him. Why is everyone stopping me? I'm trying to go to church. I'm a teenager. You think you would like that? Blah, blah, blah. Kind of yelled at him. And then he's like, son, just go get the boxes. And I was like, fine. And so I walked through the living room into this den we had, this family area there. And I turn the corner and I hear, surprise! And the whole youth group had gathered with a surprise birthday party right as I had just yelled at my dad in a really petty way. And it was one of these experiences of being humbled and, being very publicized in my sinfulness. And it wasn't fun at the time. Things like that aren't fun. It was kind of humbling. But on the other hand, it was kind of helpful. It's helpful, once again, to have our egos popped, right? Because otherwise, our egos can play funny games with us, and we start believing our own PR, and we get a big head. It's good to sometimes be humbled and realize what we are. Well, I think, like I said, this is a healthy thing, and it's certainly a normal thing. And I think this is partially what we're hearing today in the reading from Romans, right? Where St. Paul, one of the heroes of our faith, writes this about his spiritual life. He says, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want to do, but I do the very thing I hate." Right? And this is amazing to hear in a way, because this is Paul, the great evangelist, one of the heroes of the church. And yet he's sharing his personal struggle with the sense that there's always something pulling him from within. Even as he wants to follow God, there's always something pulling him from within, calling him out of who he's called to be. And he knows this well. And I'm guessing this sounds familiar, right? We all have this piece of ourselves where we kind of have a vision of what we should be, and yet so often there's another kind of vision of what we actually are. And I think what Paul is teaching here, and one of the most important things we can get from this, is that it is normal to struggle in life. It is normal to struggle with our Christian faith, right? Inner turmoil isn't an abnormal or bad experience. It is the normal experience. It doesn't make you a bad Christian or a bad human being. It makes you a normal Christian and a normal human being. And again, I think it's healthy to be able to acknowledge our own brokenness as part of our self-definition, because if we can't admit we're sinful, and we've all met people like this, right, who are just in denial anytime anything bad happens that they're part of. They can't take responsibility. And if we can't admit that we have some brokenness, we can't learn from our mistakes. We can't take responsibility. We're going to mess up our relationships. We can't grow as people. And so this is part of who we are, right? We are sinner. That's part of what we are. But here's the thing. Self-defining as a sinner is a good place to start, or at least a good piece of our personal identity. But it's a really poor place to end, right? We are sinners, and definitely we all need to know this, but that's not all we are. And that's not all God says we are. That is not a good basis for our entire identity. And the truth is, as we're sitting in here in a church, the church hasn't always done a good job of reminding people that they're more than their sins, right? Sometimes historically, or even not just historically in our lives, church has felt like the place that can be judgmental towards us, that can tell us we're not good enough. There's actually a doctrine that kind of sums up how we can be. It's this doctrine called total depravity. And this doctrine teaches that because of original sin, which is this kind of idea of Adam and Eve sinned and it was passed on, because of original sin, everything good in humanity has been lost. And essentially, this doctrine teaches that we are essentially rotten to the core until we know Jesus. And that has been a major school of thought within Christianity. In some cases, the major school of thought within Christianity. But even though we are, of course, broken, which we've been talking about, there are some big problems with seeing ourselves and others as totally rotten, as totally depraved. I mean, for one thing, it's pretty hard to reconcile that kind of teaching with the first chapter of the Bible, right? Genesis 1, where 5 times God is creating different things, and it says, it's good, it's good, it's good, talking about all the physical things and the animals and the land, and then it gets to people, and it says, God saw it, and it was very good, right? How do you reconcile that if we're seeing humanity as rotten to the core? Another thing that's kind of problematic is if you see your neighbor as rotten to the core because they haven't found Christ yet, it's pretty hard to love them, isn't it? I mean, Jesus says we should love our neighbor. How do you love someone if you see them rotten to the core, if you see nothing good in them? And then finally, seeing humanity as utterly rotten makes it pretty hard to understand the story of Jesus and the cross. Because, why would Jesus die for us if there was nothing good about us, if we were 100% rotten. If you think about salvaging, which is kind of a metaphor you can use for the cross, salvaging us on the cross, you don't salvage something when there's nothing good in it. If something's totally rotten, you throw it away. You salvage something when there may be some brokenness there, but there's still something important. There's still something valuable. There's still something beautiful. And the better explanation than total depravity, the better explanation is that Jesus' death on the cross is proof that actually we have incredible value in the eyes of God. Right? The better explanation is even though we are on the one hand broken and sinful and capable of doing great harm, and we know this, we see this in the world, we're also beautiful and beloved and made in God's image, as it says in Genesis 1, which means that we also have the potential to do great good in the world. And that the Christian story is that God wants to help us unlock that potential, and so that we can be saints. And what's really interesting is how God goes about unlocking that potential for us to be saints, which is that, He does lots of things. He dies on the cross. He teaches us a lot. But one of the things Jesus does is He makes us saints by telling us that we're saints until it becomes true. He makes us beloved by telling us we're beloved until it becomes true. He tells us we have forgiveness makes us forgiven by telling us we have forgiveness until we believe it's true. We see in today's reading an example of this kind of positive approach in a way that Christ takes. He says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives life to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they might see your good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven." And this is just a tremendous pep talk that Jesus is giving all of us, right? That the Savior is giving us. Kind of makes you feel good to hear your God, your Creator, tell you that you are the light of the world, right? So shine. What a beautiful message. And in a way, just telling people something until it becomes true seems like it's a weird strategy, but it's actually a very good strategy. It actually works, at least to an extent. The great teachers of the world, whether music or whatever they're teaching, the first thing they do is they make their students believe they can do it, believe they can learn. I actually recently heard a story about this, where they were doing a study on the way self-belief affects kids who are taking tests. And one of the well-known things in education is that people of color statistically haven't scored as well as people not of color. And so they wanted to look at why is this? And so they set up this test, a fake test, but in terms of it wasn't part of a school, but a test nonetheless, where they took a group of students of different races, and they said before the test, we just want to let you know that statistically people of color don't do as well on this test. Kind of a harsh thing to say, but that's what they said. And then everyone took the test, and sure enough, people of color did very poorly on the test compared to other groups. But then they ran the test again, a different group, or a different test, I should say. And before the test, they said, actually, we've done a study, and your race has nothing to do with how well you could do on the test. Any race can do just as well. And they took the test, a different test again, and the results showed that people of color did just as well as anyone else. And what they concluded from the test, that it wasn't an innate ability that was the issue, it was a society and a culture and everything around them telling them not to have self-belief, telling them that they weren't good enough, and so it's kind of this self-fulfilling thing. There's a really neat ministry that kind of uses the same philosophy called Homeboy Ministries, or Homeboy Industries, I should say. It's an outreach in Los Angeles, inner city Los Angeles. Amazing priest who was part of this church, and he just kept on doing funerals for these kids who were getting caught up in gangs and dying. And so he couldn't handle it anymore. He started this thing to try to recover people from gang life. And it's an amazing ministry. It's helped hundreds and hundreds of people. It completely reforms their identity, pulls them out of that life, and then gives them jobs, right? Helps them connect with employment, because when you have tattoos from head to toe and all this stuff, it's hard to get a job. So he helps them get a job. Really has changed a lot of lives. And I heard him once talking about their philosophy of how they do what they do. And he said, when we're looking to build people up, there's two approaches we could take. One approach is the measuring stick method, which is that we kind of stand in judgment of people. We kind of, metaphorically speaking, hold up a measuring stick and tell them, you're not good enough and you need to measure up. And he says this is a way we can do it. This is a way we often do it with people who are struggling. But he says it never works. And he says if he does this with the people he's dealing with, it doesn't make them measure up. It just makes them feel small and worthless and despair that they can never be good enough in the eyes of God and others. But he says the other way you can go, and the way they go, is instead of holding up a measuring stick, you hold up a mirror in front of people and you tell them you are a precious child of God. And you tell them that over and over in lots of different ways, and you build them up and you involve them and embrace them in things, and you watch them rise to the self-image that you're giving them. And he says that is the way that actually works. That's the way that's worked for their ministry. And this sounds exactly what Jesus is doing with us. You are the light of the world, right? He believes in the good in us so that we can embrace it in ourselves and believe in it ourselves and live it ourselves. And so today Jesus invites us to know who we really are, to know on one hand our brokenness, because otherwise we're kidding ourselves, but also to know that we are so much more than our brokenness. Because underneath that brokenness, and even in that brokenness, is a person who God lovingly created to shine with light. And so as Jesus says, shine, because it's what you were born to do. Amen.